Good day, viewer, and welcome to a recording on the literature essay with English with Joshua. This structure is relevant for grade 10 all the way to grade 12. Please expect the literature essay in both papers 2 and 3, respectively. The purpose of a literature essay is to prove or disapprove a statement. This means that you as a student are creating a specific goal that you have to live up to through writing this essay. So it's not just a summary of a text or a creative response. To accomplish this goal, you need to work from a detailed plan. You can't just wing it because that will lead to a disaster. As a student, you also need to make sure that you have very good working knowledge on the text that you are expected to write on. So if you choose the topic, make sure that you are well informed on it. Finally, this argument that you carry out in your literature essay needs to be presented in a clearly structured way so that it becomes compelling. An argument is essential for, number one, persuasive short answers in literature and language exams. So it's not just a skill that you learn for a literature essay. Number two, to answer any question in any subject where you have to convince your reader or your listener of your point. So for example, if you are in a law classroom or studying law, you'd also have to convince the reader or the listener of your point. If you're a businessman, you need to persuade and convince the reader or the listener again of your point. So arguing is an essential part of life. Number three, it's useful for getting what you want. For example, a job, or you're trying to get a date with someone, or trying to convince your parents about something that you should have in your life. So remember that when you are arguing or stating your point or disproving a point, it needs to be logical. Now let's look at the literary process, because the writing in general is a process. You'd first have to plan, then you'd go through the writing process, which is the introduction, body, and conclusion. Once you're done with your first draft, you need to edit it, actively editing your errors. Finally, you will compose your final draft. At the end of every final draft, there needs to be a word count. Please don't forget that, grade 10s to 12s. Arguments in a literature essay have 4 basic ingredients. And these ingredients that we focus on today are for the peel structure. The first one would be that you would state your point or make a statement that you're trying to prove. The second one is giving you evidence that supports that point that you try to prove. Thirdly, you'll explain further on how your evidence proves your point. And lastly, you will make sure to link all 3 sentences back to the topic that you're dealing with. It's important to understand the structure and make sure that you follow it to the T in your exams as well as your formal assignments. When planning, try to avoid using a cloud. This is why. Because there's no way your organization will be logical unless you're numbering it in some instance. We also notice that there's no way of checking if your ideas are relevant because they're not following a structured process. We also see that there's a chance of repetition in ideas that could be presented in a mind map. So instead, here's a different structure that you could follow when preparing your planning. Dear grade 12 learner, if you are finding the English with Joshua videos helpful, please remember to like, share, and subscribe so that we may continue to reach many other grade 12 learners. All the best. Try to use a box structure plan like this one. So you see at the top, you would write your introduction, and this here contains the main statement that you're trying to prove. Simplest way is to make sure that you understand the question or the topic that you are presented with. And then in your introduction, make sure to have the key points of that topic written up there. With this block plan, you'd be able to link everything back to that center, your introduction that holds the main statement or the thesis that you're trying to prove. So, for example, paragraph 1, or we could consider this idea or argument 1. Remember, very important, that every paragraph must have its own idea. You cannot be mixing different ideas in one paragraph. It then loses the structure, and then the essence and the strength of your argument is going to be non-existent. Paragraph 1 or argument 1, you would state first the point, like we had discussed the Peel method. Then you would give your evidence as to why you are stating this point and why it is valid. You would further explain your evidence and how it goes back to your point. And then lastly, you would link it back to the point you're trying to make, or back to the main statement that you have tried to make. And you would do the same with all the ideas that you would like to present to prove your statement. So each paragraph would follow the Peel method structure, and then when you conclude, that is when you would summarize the main reasons that your thesis is correct. Remember that when you argue, you're trying to prove or disprove something. Therefore, your argument needs to be valid in order to persuade or convince your reader or your listener. And it cannot be so if there is no structure that is followed. Let's look at an example of the box structure plan that was presented in the previous slide. You may add as many paragraphs or arguments as necessary. In this example, I am presenting just 2 arguments of the 4 in the structure. As we look at the introduction, it reads, I should have more pocket money because I will learn to manage money responsibly and I'll be a happier person. That is the argument that is being put on the table. In paragraph 1 or argument 1, the point that will be stated after this introduction is that I will learn to manage money responsibly. This indicates the point that then goes back to the thesis statement, having pocket money, I'll learn to manage money responsibly, and I'll be a happier person. Remember that each paragraph here is supposed to prove that statement. The example then gives evidence, and here the evidence is Mark Shuttleworth started his own business using his pocket money. The explanation, Mark Shuttleworth's parents' small investment in pocket money has made a huge return in terms of Mark's achievements, and they spent far less than what they would have spent on a business degree. Now that we've made the point, given evidence, we've explained the evidence, it now needs to pull this whole argument together by linking it back to the main idea or this thesis that was made in the introduction. The link here is with just a little pocket money, I could be the next Mark Shuttleworth. So that is the structure that you would follow. In paragraph 2, a second argument was made, following the same structure. The point, second point, I will have a better social life and therefore be a happier person. We need to see evidence after the point. Teenagers socialize at places like McDonald's, malls, and the movies. Going to these places costs money. You need to further explain this evidence that you have given of teenagers socializing in malls and movie places that you need money for. And the explanation here is, if I could afford to go to places where my friends socialize, I'll spend time with friends, get to know them better, and form good friendships. That's a beautiful explanation for the evidence that was provided that teenagers socialize in such places. Now you pull it back together, or pull everything together to present it well. The link reads, All of this will improve my social life and make me less lonely and a happier person. What makes these points more formal, what makes them more persuasive, is that they follow a strict structure. This strict structure makes sure that the points presented or the ideas or the arguments presented in each of these paragraphs leads to answering the thesis statement or the main argument that is presented by the writer. So if you were to conclude, you use this example, the conclusion reads, if I become a more responsible, more financially astute, and happier person, surely a little extra investment in my pocket money is worthwhile. The structure of a literature essay is followed, that being the Peel method. The Peel method is fairly simple to follow. Now let's look at the writing process. Firstly, you need to analyze the topic. Make sure that you understand what is expected of you. And secondly, you need to produce the box structure essay plan that was just shown to you previously. Try to avoid using the cloud mind map. Thirdly, write your essay out in fluent full sentences. This is very important because it is a formal essay. Therefore, you need to avoid shortening sentences. You need to avoid colloquialism or slang. You need to make sure that the register of this essay is formal. The next step would be to edit very carefully. This is when you're looking for spelling mistakes, grammar, syntax error. Make sure you edit carefully so that you can maximize on the language, structure, and editing marks that you receive from writing this essay. Lastly, you then present your final draft. Remember that when you are presenting your final draft, that you would scratch out the first draft. This makes it easier for the marker to be able to not make the mistake of marking the incorrect draft. Secondly, you could write final draft above the final draft. Please make sure that when you write your essays, you remember to include a word count. Grade 10, grade 11, and grade 12 have a different word count for the literature essay. Be mindful of the word count. The writing process. Analyze the topic or the question. When you are sitting in your exam, make sure that you read with a highlighter. The point is to understand the key points. You highlight these keywords. You highlight the instructional verbs as well as the important points. Once you do understand what you're supposed to be doing with the topic or what you're supposed to be analyzing, that is when you're able to move on to the next step. This would be to explore the connotations or the deeper meanings of the key words in the question. In most cases, you're not expected to respond literally to the text, but there could be some connotations or deeper meanings that could be expected from you when you are writing your literature essay. The next and final point of analyzing the topic or the question is that this essay demands planned, organized, and focused expression of thought development, perception, and critical evaluation about the text in question, following the rigors of essay writing, of introduction, body, and conclusion. So basically, you need to make sure that it is well planned out, that everything that you're expected to do, from the structure to evaluating the topic to responding correctly to the text to editing, needs to be done in a very orderly manner. This topic does demand that it should be a polished, finished product. Then you move on in the writing process to now draft your introduction. Once the planning has been done in the box structure, you will then rewrite the essay question as a statement in the top box of that essay plan. This will form the basis of your introduction. Remember to focus on the keywords. They should be evident in that statement. Make sure that all of the key terms in the question are referred to in your introduction. Define the terms if it's necessary to do so. State the 3 or 4 points that will be discussed in the essay to prove the argument. These are the 3 or 4 points that will make up the paragraphs in the body of your essay. We need to be introduced to them in the body of the essay. Keep your introduction short and capture the interest of the reader. These are a few things that are assessed in the literature essay. The first thing we look at is content. Did you interpret the topic correctly? What is the depth of your judgment? Your justification, is it enough? Is it clear? Is it relevant? And your grasp of the text. Do you understand the text that was presented to you to analyze? Please note that the content section is comprised of 60% of the total for the literature essay. Secondly, we look at language and structure. Structure is what we're looking at, so make sure that the Peel method is followed thoroughly. Presentation and logical flow. If you follow the structure of the box plan, there shall be a logical flow. Also make sure that you keep your ideas in a chronological order in order for it to make sense to the marker. Your tone and your style is very important. This is a literary essay. It must be informal style, it must be informal tone. So avoid anything that is informal. This totals 40%, which is a great chunk of the mark component. This totals 40%, so it needs to be prioritized as much as the content. So in raw marks, the content is 15 marks, language and structure is the 10 marks of the 25. Once you're done drafting the introduction, you move on to drafting the body. The body of the essay will include paragraphs which will be developed logically, and each paragraph will relate directly to the topic following the Peel method. Each paragraph must discuss a new idea and must be supported by information from the text. For example, if you are responding to a Romeo and Juliet essay, wherever examples are supposed to be put into the Peel structure, you must have a relevant example from the Romeo and Juliet text to help argue your point. Each of the points stated in the introduction must now be argued in detail following the Peel method. It is important that the introduction indicates which ideas will follow in the body, and in that same order. That is how they should appear in the body of the essay. The Peel method in the body of the essay. You need to state the point in some more detail than the introduction so that the point is clearly understood by the reader. Then you provide evidence from the text that validates the point. The second E in the Peel method, you would then explain how the evidence supports this. Lastly, you would link it back to the topic to show how this point furthers the argument of this essay. So if you were to make sure that you follow the Peel method correctly in the planning process, then you would be able to do better in putting together your first draft. Here's an example using the text Hamlet to show how the structure needs to be followed. The topic of the text reads, "Deception and manipulation are central to the tragic consequences in the play, Hamlet." Please be mindful of the fact that when you are naming the text that you are writing about, it has to be in inverted commas to indicate that it is the name of the text and not the character that you speak of. Critically discuss the extent to which you agree with the above statement. So the main thing we're supposed to be talking about is deception and manipulation being a central point to the tragic consequences in the play. The first point made is, many characters engage in some form of manipulative behavior in order to achieve their own ends, and this results in tragedy. Point is made, we need to give evidence that there are many characters that do this. So the evidence that is given here is that Claudius appears to be an able and wise ruler. However, he's ruthless and an ambitious villain. This is already responding to the deception and the manipulation, as we see that he's ruthless and he's ambitious. But please note that the evidence comes directly from the text, as we've seen this character behave in such a way. We need to further explain why we say this character is then behaving in this fashion. The explanation is that Claudius murdered his brother to become the king. He also seduced Gertrude. Here's facts from the text. Then you need to close off this argument by linking it back to the text. The link is that Claudius's actions leads to his own death, which is true, as well as the deaths of Hamlet, Gertrude, and Polonius. We can see now that we've answered the fact that the character is manipulative or deceptive. We've also answered that there are tragic consequences in the play. The consequences here were those of death. Argument number 2's point reads, Hamlet's extreme behavior and his antique disposition to deceive Claudius. Our evidence is that Hamlet's rejection of Ophelia, or the treatment towards his mother, or the killing of Polonius, you could use any of those as evidence, or taking on Laertes. These could have been all or different kinds of evidence that could be used as examples to indicate Hamlet's extreme behavior and how it is used here to deceive Claudius. The explanation is that this allows him to investigate the ghost's claim and determine his cause of revenge. We would say Ophelia's suicide, or Polonius's murder, or Gertrude's repentance and death, all are the tragic consequences to the manipulation and deception that Hamlet has presented. So if you were to conclude, obviously in this example of the introduction and conclusion, you would note that it's just the ideas that we've given there. However, the structure of the introduction and the conclusion are not in the form of Peel method, but that could always be worked on later on. This was to show the examples of how you would put together the body of the essay. To continue with this essay example, you could try to add on and explore other supporting points made. For example, you could talk about Rosencrantz and Guildenstern's deception. You could also talk about Laertes conspiring with Claudius. You could talk about the play within the play, which 3-1, which is called The Murder of Gonzago, and how it's used by Hamlet to trick Claudius into revealing his guilt. As we continue with the writing process, it's important to look at the conclusion. Once you're done with the body, you need to look at starting your conclusion. This is a very simple paragraph. The purpose of it is to state what the essay has accomplished by restating the goal of the essay and briefly referring to each of the content points in the body. This is where you show that you've proved your main point or your thesis that you made in the introduction. Therefore, you cannot be adding any new points or material that you have not dealt with in the body. No new points allowed. It's important that we look at the tone and the style of the essay. Remember that this is an argumentative essay written about literature. Therefore, you need to argue in the third person to generate an academic and detached tone. You cannot involve yourself by using the word I or you. It needs to be written in the third person. When you are pressed to use a pronoun, try to stick to the word one. For example, if instead of saying you will see, you would then say one could see. Second point, the argument is done in present tense and the summary in the past tense. Anything that has to do with literature stays in present tense because the story never dies out. It never becomes the past. It stays forever in the present. The style of English needs to be formal without any colloquialism or slang. Do not have shortened words in your writing. You cannot have words like wanna or because written BECOZ. Try to avoid anything that could lead to your tone or style becoming informal. The confident tone needs to be adapted throughout. But confidence can only happen in your writing once you are sure of the structure. It would help you to avoid words that would make your essay sound shaky. 10 marks are assigned for style language, so employ direct register. Try to avoid figures of speech as they may add unintended meanings. Remember that we need to make sure that we respond to the topic that was presented. Should you add extra things in that could take you off track or change the meaning of what you intended to say, then it's going to lead to you losing these 10 marks. So try to keep it as clean as you can, avoiding as many more relaxed, more creative style of writing. The use of comedy or personal anecdotes or stories are inappropriate. We cannot involve ourselves in literature essay writing. This is supposed to be formal, firstly, secondly, academic, and that is why we avoid everything to do with our personal lives. When we are arguing, you need to be detached from it because it is a literature piece. So avoid anything that will make your essay sound inappropriate. Now that the writing process is over, it's important to start your editing. When you're editing your essay, check that you have included everything from your plan. Check that you did put your paragraphs in the correct order. Check that you did refer to the question at least once per paragraph. Check whether you've avoided any storytelling. Storytelling is inevitable if you are not following the structure presented. It's important that you follow the structure, or else you'll start storytelling. Check, have you argued throughout your essay? Check, have you edited? Have you checked the grammar? Have you checked the spelling? Is your work neatly presented? Lastly, check if you have placed your word count. I hope this assists you in presenting a strong literature essay. If this is helping you, please remember to like, share, and subscribe so that we can reach many more learners that it needs to get to. Thank you very much for all your support thus far.